Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. This is the first SEFI at Work organized this year by the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion SIG. I am one of the three co-chairs, and the other two co-chairs are Fiona and Chika, both from UCL. So on behalf of them, I'd like to welcome you to the SEFI at Work. I am joined today by three of my favorite colleagues, Natalie, Inej, and Sierra, with whom I worked on this particular project. And I will let them introduce themselves briefly.
Well, hi, I'm Sierra Isaac. I'm Jolene's colleague. As promised.
My name is Natalie Wynn, and I'm from UCL.
Hi, and I'm Inês Direito, and I'm joining from University of Aveiro in Portugal.
So on behalf of the four of us, also thank you very much for being here. Now, our purpose for being here is to share with you the study that many of you might have been a part of that we recently published, looking at inclusivity within our SEFI conferences. And so I'm going to put the link to the paper in there a little later, but we will walk you through some of it. The point is not to talk at you. We would like to hear more from you and more about your experiences. So please feel free to unmute yourselves and share or raise your hands, and I will call on you. And we would really like you to be participative. Oh, there you are, Ryder, in one of your fabulous shirts as always. Thank you for adding color. All right, so I will now hand it over to Sierra, and Sierra will tell you a little bit more about the study itself.
Great. So as Darlene said, our goal isn't to repeat the paper to you. When we say share, we mean talk about not asking people to share their lived experiences necessarily of what was challenging in conferences. That isn't the format for an online recorded session, but more thinking about when you're organizing events, when we are organizing events, when we're organizing the next conference, what are the things that we should be thinking about to continue to move this work forward? So our motivations in terms of undertaking this work in the first place was partly informed by prior research on academic conferences in terms of the importance of academic conferences around connecting professionals and developing professionals on their career pathways, particularly in engineering education, where the network tends to be quite thin and distributed, that people might not have close colleagues in their institution. So the annual conferences have a really big impact there. And that there have been a number of previous studies that have found really important barriers to submission process, to actually attending the conferences, and then also to the engagement and having constructive conversations during the conference. So we took the opportunity to be proactive when hosting SEFI 2024 to think that how could we ensure that the conference is better reflecting the values that we would like it to be embodying? So not in response to a particular difficulty, but in the absence of data, we could either assume that the conference is inclusive and we don't have a problem, but that's not actually, that's staying in our comfort zone and saying, everything seems to be kind of okay. But if we truly want to be inclusive, we really need to be proactive. And so to actually go and look for data, to look for what the markers are that would show us that the conference was actually serving the function that we want it to serve and being inclusive in that way. So it was a proactive step in terms of doing that. So Joylene, what we actually did was we started by doing a survey. So I said that we informed by prior research, but then actually collecting data from SEFI attendees, particularly particularly reaching out to the two prior conferences, of asking them about the barriers that they had encountered related to submitting or attending the conference, to inform the actions, then a series of actions that were actually implemented during SEFI 2024. There's a lot more details about these in the paper, but they included free daycare for the first time at a SEFI conference, an ally training breakfast on the first morning, additional support around the formulation of visa letters that actually get through the consulates and embassies more effectively, multilingual subtitles, a variety of activities. And then following up with survey 2, during the conference where we actually sought to capture people's experiences in the moment. So survey 2 is quite different from survey 1, not just because it was implemented after the initiatives, but because we were trying to catch the little things, not the, I remember 2 years ago this happened, it had a big impact, but the little in the moment experiences where people said, I really felt like I belonged when, or when someone did this, I felt excluded from the group, to be able to identify really the sorry, I'm trying to use a French word, the areas of action that we can have at a more micro level of stepping towards a more inclusive conference.
Okay, so we're not going to go through all of the findings because the paper will give you that. We're going to highlight some of the key findings, I guess, that we'd like to share with you today. So we'll firstly focus on some maybe more of the positive aspects. So this first data figure is from the first survey. So in relation to recent conferences at the time, 2022, 23. So we can see from this, we've got various, I guess, measures of belonging, different statements that people might agree with if they feel like they belong in the community. So comfortable with being myself, feeling heard, receiving support, those types of things. And you can see for most of these factors, the majority are strongly agreeing or agreeing that these are true. So that does give us some positive news in terms of belonging. I guess a couple more additional points I would make is that we did see a correlation between the number of conferences people had attended in the past, so that we asked them to give like a rough number they had attended, and their sense of belonging, which I guess we might not find surprising. I guess if you're more embedded and you've been to more conferences, you might feel like you belong more to a certain community. The second sort of analysis that we did on this was trying to see if people with certain identities or characteristics were more or less likely to feel like they belong, and we didn't find any significant difference between those different characteristics. So that's the first sort of piece of data or insight that we wanted to share.
This next slide is about survey 2. So as Sarah mentioned, there was a lot of new activities that were implemented at SEFI 24 in Lausanne in order to promote more equity, and some activities such as ally training, the morning wellness activities, and some of these initiatives were in fact informed by the findings of survey 1. So getting to know what colleagues who participated in SEFI 22 and or 23 would like to see as an activity or as a support in a future conference. So things like childcare, scholarship, and more structured networking during the conference. And what is really interesting is that even the participants or the respondents who did not benefit specifically from these actions saw a lot of value in having this in the conference. Also, some of the written comments that respondents left in the survey about the initiatives was that for some of them, it was the first time they were experiencing and seeing and witnessing these activities taking place in the conference. And I think this speaks a lot about, we're really motivated to continuing and expanding these inclusion activities in future SEFI conferences.
Okay, so we'll now move on to, I guess, some areas that we can sort of use in order to inform future work and initiatives. So in terms of what this sort of graph is showing us, so this is respondents' perceptions of the impact that barriers to submitting and attending have on the SEFI conference itself. So this is really about, irrespective of whether you experience barriers, what do you think the impact of anyone having barriers is? So it's not necessarily that it impacts you in that certain way. It's also that you've got to think about how, for those it does impact, whether it impacts the conference. So interesting to see here that, some respondents reported experiencing barriers to submitting and attending SEFI, and being the target of unwanted behaviors, as having a major impact. So a small, I guess a smaller amount of people saw it as having a big or huge impact we put here. So this is this dark purple color. So you can see unwanted behaviors. That's 15 out of the 104. Barriers to attending, 27 out of the 104. And then barriers to submitting a proposal, 10 out of the 112. And then we have, moderate as well. However, what is also interesting to see is that most respondents considered these factors to have a sort of negligible or small impact on the SEFI conference itself. So to some degree, I guess we might suggest here that there's maybe a lack of understanding of how much barriers can impact certain people. So most responders aren't thinking that these barriers impact the conference itself, and so maybe they're just not as aware of some people being impacted by barriers. So I guess one interpretation of this is that even though we've made advances in this area towards a sort of positive organizational culture, it's not necessarily sort of permeated amongst the whole community in terms of perceptions.
In terms of who is excluded from the conferences and how, so at the conference, we gather some evidence about the ways people interact. There's some sort of an implicit way of interacting, these perceived hierarchies of who belongs in the space and who is worth the time to speak to interact to listen to, and give some legitimacy to what they're saying. And this was particularly relevant for newcomers, right, who didn't have an experience of the conference, who didn't know how to navigate. So there's a clear need to have more explicit, open, transparent ways of working, even the ways participants could interact with particular activities or the SIGs. So there's a need to have that more explicit and more out there. On the other side, even without interacting with the conference itself, there were so many factors that excluded participants from participating, and this was way before being there in the space. It's about visa restrictions. There were so many critical stories of colleague of ours that were not able to attend because of papers and approvals and timelines. And also the high travel costs. We know that usually North European countries are more resourceful in terms of providing these sources of funding for their participants, and also the dominance of the English language on everything we do in the SEFI space. And this was really interesting to observe in SEFI Lausanne, because the language was way more diverse there. There were so many activities with in French and the subtitles of keynote speakers that really made a difference. And I think it was the perfect place to explore that. But maybe there's ways to explore other languages and not focus on that, because many attendees, well, as you can see by my accent, we're not native speakers, and for some of our colleagues, it's a barrier to interact with others and feel safe in sharing ideas and working with others. Another finding that was quite interesting is even that individuals that we see as being privileged in the engineering education spaces, so white male straight participants, they also experienced unwanted behaviors in the same frequency as colleagues with other identities. But they believe these behaviors were targeted as a result of their academic title or position as being more senior, or having a more detached role in terms of research or teaching. So that was also an interesting finding that we observed in the survey.
Okay, so final sort of slide we're going to go through in terms of the finding. I guess the other sort of things that came up was around there being a lack of guidance around what to do in the case of challenging situations. So maybe people didn't necessarily know who to go to or how to report different instances that they might see. so that sort of mode of communication wasn't necessarily clear. I guess sort of linked to this is the perception from some that there's an inadequate response to issues raised, so issues of bullying and harassment, for example. And so some people were, even if they experienced it, they were put off from reporting anyway, because they didn't feel that they would get any response from doing that. So there was not any benefit to be gained for them, and maybe it would be quite challenging. Again, quite similar. I think there's some appreciation for the work that's been done around the code of conduct and recent changes to the code of conduct, but again, sort of lack of clarity around the consequences of breaking that, and therefore what its role sort of plays within the community. And then I guess finally, in relation to this sort of set of different findings, we sort of saw that quite a few individuals sort of said that they would take responsibility for preventing instances themselves. So removing them, having to leave a certain space because they felt like, they might get unwanted behavior or harassment if they stayed in the space, for example, which obviously shows us, people not being able to fully engage in the community or the activities going on in order to sort of protect and prevent instances themselves, so partially linked with this, them feeling that there was some inadequate response, just generally, and not knowing how to raise issues was maybe that they had to take on that load themselves. So to some degree, I guess we interpreted that there might be some kind of disconnect between value statements, and sort of rhetoric and what actually happened and practice.
So that was some of the points that we wanted to make to you. Hopefully you've had a chance to skim the paper, but even if you haven't, I'll put the link to it in a moment. What we would like to move the conversation now is to you. And how do you relate? How do you relate to not just the findings, but also our interpretation of the findings? While Nat and Inej were talking to you, they talked to you about what we found in the survey, but also some of our hypotheses and why we think some of these things are happening, why we think what could possibly be done. This is where we would like you to bring yourself in. And so we have these 3 questions that I have put on the screen here. What we're going to do now is take a few minutes, each one individually grappling through those questions. I'm also going to put the link to the paper itself in the chat in case you want to go and see what a particular finding was, or if you want to see how we interpreted that particular finding, you're welcome to do that as well now. And at the end of these 3 or 4 minutes, once you've had a chance to grapple with these questions for yourself, we would like to have a discussion with all of you. And so at that point, feel free to type in your what you need to say into the chat, or unmute yourselves and talk as well. But for now, for the next 3 minutes, I'd like you to just think about these questions with respect to your experiences, be it at SEFI or be it at any other conference, and what you thought our findings and our interpretation was. I'm going to give you some time to do that. About 30 seconds more for you to think. And at the end of that, please feel free to share your opinions, and Ciara will moderate that discussion with you. All right, Ciara, it's all yours.
Great. So taking advantage of the fact that we are temporally co-located, that you have organized your day to be here at the same time as other people, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity to actually have an interaction and discussion. There's the three questions here on the slide about how do we engage other people, how do we hear from other groups that or individuals that we might not be hearing from, and the barriers that they're facing. How do our way of interpreting these findings and the findings that we found, the experiences that we collected, do they relate to your experience? Do they surprise you? And what can SEFI do in general, in conferences and in general, to actually be more accountable and transparent and embody the values that we announce, to actually make sure they're following through in our actions? So as Joylene said, you could either raise your hand if you would like to speak. So there's a little hand symbol in the upper menu for Teams. For me, it's sort of in the middle between participants and React symbols. You can type comments into the chat section. So giving so feel free to jump in when you want, or add to the chat. Something that I found particularly interesting and important about that came out of our results was how so actually as soon as Lausanne was announced as the hosts for 2024, which was at the closing in Dublin, I was asked about 90 seconds later whether or not there would be daycare in Lausanne. And in fact, that's what our data showed as well, is that when the people's decisions to submit a contribution depended on their options for childcare. And so that means that in fact, the options for childcare needed to be announced really early. In fact, at the time that people would start to prepare a communication was when people needed to know about childcare options, not when they were choosing to attend the conference, but when they were already investing the work in the preparation and how early that needed to be. So in the chat, I see a question from Stefan. Do we know what other types of barriers might exist? Could you say a little bit more about what?
Yes, hello. So
Hi.
I'm Stefan. I'm from TU Delft, Industrial Design Engineering. And my particular interest is because I will be hosting another kind of conference in about a year. So this is, and I'm the faculty diversity officer, so I have particular interest. So one of the things we know is that the neurodiversity is relatively higher amongst engineering people. So, for instance, engaging with others in large crowds is already a struggle. So that kind of barrier, and also something like replying on a questionnaire online is sometimes people would like to do it, but in the daily struggle, you just skip it for all kinds of reasons. So I was wondering, do you have any, let's say, ideas or remembering what kind of barriers you know from the neurodiverse people at SEFI conference?
Yeah, so so we in terms of polling, in terms of in the pre-survey, we asked people about whether or not they had physical disability or limitations that impacted their ability to attend the conference, whether they had psychological or emotional challenges that would impact their ability to participate, or if they had neurological, I can't remember. Anyway, I'm sort of looking at those, at different aspects of people's identity that could be potentially impacting their identity. As Nat said, we have a very diverse group of people, and so given our sample set, we weren't able to make particular findings about we weren't able to make particular recommendations based on our own data. What we do know from prior work, though, that was incorporated into the conference was about having a quiet space that was inside the space, but that people could go and in fact, the keynotes were broadcast into a second room where people could watch online and manage in their own space. I know that I found that really useful at one point. Nat, did you have another contribution there?
No, I before you said it, I was going to say about there were a couple of comments in the survey about having areas that people could go to when they needed some time out, especially like the way that social like informal and other alternatives for networking, I guess, that like obviously a lot of the benefits that we sort of see with conferences are around informal aspects as opposed to formal, and I guess like yeah, so and sensory overload in terms of like, the amount of people, the smells, like food is often served, hot food, like all of these things, right? And sometimes that's, that is hard because of the building environments that conferences are often in. So yes, there were definitely comments where like I feel like there was definitely a lot more quiet space at some conferences than others, and I guess it depends on the building. So I think that's something that we have bear in mind, is making that clear. I think the other thing, like the social aspects and different ways of networking, I don't know if I necessarily like have an answer to, but I think thinking of those different ways is quite important. I mean, I think you touched upon as well is like, how do you get, like, we would be really interested in getting more data from people who maybe haven't engaged as much with DEI, and we realize that a lot of these survey data might be skewed by the fact that the people want to fill it in if they've been impacted in certain ways, right? And so I think, we're also trying to understand different ways in which we can obtain this data. So sorry, I can't be more helpful, but they're just some of the thoughts I remember regarding that, definitely the social aspect, networking aspect.
All right, Julie, do you want to come in really briefly, and then we're going to get to Allison's question?
Yeah, so Sierra mentioned this a little earlier, but I wanted to come back to it. It was conferences allow you to interact in small groups, so you can attend one of the small group sessions if you'd like to or not. But usually keynotes, you are in a big auditorium with everybody, and that can really be overwhelming. And so one of the things that we consciously did at SEFI 2024 was we had the big auditorium, but we also had two other rooms which were right next to the auditorium where it was being live streamed. And so you could sit there in a smaller crowd. You didn't have to interact with everybody. The sensory overload there was much smaller, but you were participating exactly in the same way that everybody else was. And you also had an opportunity to interact. So everybody was typing their questions out. Nobody was raising their hand, even in the main auditorium. And so there was equity in the way you were able to participate, even though you were not in the main room. So, yeah.
So Allison, I understand that your comment is relating to question 1 on the slide about trying to collect feedback, perhaps at moments where newcomers are already together, like at the newcomers lunch. I think that's a really interesting idea. Do you want to add anything to that, or? All right, so I'm going to go to Comfort comment, not a question. But so Comfort's question or comment about saying that actual inclusion involves actually looking at not just how do we support the people that are already here, but who are the people that aren't even here. And so that was something that was interesting for us in terms of having a baseline of looking at, as a European engineering education conference, who is our public, who works in the institutions that are here. So not trying to exclude people that are outside of Europe, but making sure that all researchers that are based in European institutions are able to come. And certainly we're interested in a broader conversation, but making sure that we're really trying to serve those people that we know come from all over the world. They're based in European institutions, but they are, they're either in terms of the passport that they hold, or in terms of their background are quite diverse, and so that means that there's quite a bit of difference in the profiles and the experiences that they're having here. It's challenging to identify. That's a really, I really take your point. It's really important to find out who we're not even hearing from. And that is a challenge, and that's sort of what we're exactly a question that we're interested in discussing with you and working to improve is who are we not even in conversation with. Alison. Okay. So Alison is not able to comment verbally at the moment, based on Teams challenges. So feel free to either continue to type comments, Alison, or to jump in verbally if you want. Renata, I'm not able to read your comment. It's cut off after 4 words.
I can read it out to you. Do you think it's possible to ask the participants if they need any assistance so the committee can organize accordingly, or is it better to anticipate and communicate the attendees?
So I think that from our overall findings, I'd say that that we didn't find any magic solutions. That in fact, what you need to do to address inclusion is a lot of different things. So I'd say the answer is both. That some things like childcare, people know that they will still have a child next year and they are planning accordingly. And so those things need to happen. But in the moment, but both. Because also in the moment, I did have a plan for childcare, but my partner's working situation has changed, or my mother fell sick, or whatever it was that was my plan is no longer my plan. So I think it really needs to be both. And the people that are perhaps experiencing more of those logistical challenges about physically being there, or the challenges about being able to participate fully, are likely, those difficulties overlap. So as the non-native speaker with a young child traveling from a distance and jet lag, and perhaps on a non-European passport, all of that amplifies the number of barriers that I could be potentially encountering in terms of participating. Joylene, you wanted to add something there.
Yes. So to Renata, this is why it's really important for us to gather this data about at a SEFI level, what are some of the common difficulties that people have, so that every single year, every institution does not have to figure this out for themselves, but also SEFI is a conference that is organized in Europe. But there are other European conferences as well who can say like, oh yeah, my people come from a similar type of academic crowd, so maybe they also have the same difficulties, so we can learn from each other, which is what we did here as well. And the thing about an example of long-term planning, but also in the moment, is we had made really we had taken into account physical accessibility. So we wanted to make sure all our spaces are accessible to people who are, on wheelchairs or have some sort of mobility issues. We did not anticipate anybody having those issues, except 1 week before the conference, our keynote speaker broke her leg. And so then we were like, we need a wheelchair and we need all these other things. But it was okay for us to get a wheelchair because everything else had already been done. Because everything else, we had already planned for somebody coming with crutches, what is going to happen. We just didn't plan to have a wheelchair on the premise. But that was something that could be fixed quickly, rather than having to shift everything to a different location where it would be wheelchair accessible. So there is a little bit of both happening in there as well.
And Ines, you had a contribution there as well.
Yeah, just to follow up on Alison's comments on the importance of hearing the newcomers and supporting the newcomers. So SEFI already, by practice, has this lunch events just for newcomers, but it can be a bit daunting as well because it's within the conference setting. People are getting to know each other for the first time. So one of the things we've done in the past that I think worked really well, and it was again with very small numbers, I think we're 12, 13, 14 people. It was an informal gathering prior to the conference, something very chilled, some food, some soft drinks, just to get to know each other and know a few familiar faces at the conference, whether newcomers or not, but having that sense of, oh, I know that person. So if things get a bit stressful for me, I can reach out or I can have a chat and feel a bit more, part of the whole thing. But yeah, newcomers, I think it's something that should be invested on every conference because they don't know the ways of working and they shouldn't know, and we shouldn't have ways of working that are implicit, and things need to be more supportive and clear.
So I think that in terms of the structure of the newcomers lunch, that it was actually a structured activity. So not just you could come there but there was actually, in terms of at Lausanne, there was sort of a bingo type activity that was a prompt to go and start talking to people. And also the ribbons that both people who were part of the host committee or people that had identified as being ready to be a SEFI ally of having that the little ribbons on the name tags of an additional, please come and talk to me. Oh, the SIG co-chairs, I think, also have had little designations of talk to me about EPFL or about Lausanne, of encouraging, of sort of that idea of if I recognize somebody who's an organizer, a SEFI rep, of so trying to make sure that those people that are in that organizing role are more visible so that it makes it easier to identify them and to recognize them. There's a comment here from Vincent about financial barriers, and also the co-occurrence with financial barriers, and often visa as well, which can both add cost and slows down your ability to actually plan to buy a ticket, which then means you've got a more expensive travel costs. I don't think that at the moment SEFI has any formal policy around offering scholarships in terms of an overall policy.
I mean, it might be worth us making clear that we don't represent SEFI, right? First and foremost. But I guess what I would say with respect to that is you would hope that if there's enough voice around it, I guess this is why we do this type of work, right? To understand people's different perceptions, and to provide evidence that there should be these things. So I think this is all a work in progress for future, I would hope. I would like to think anyway.
It was also, funding was identified as the primary barrier across all survey respondents. And I think that with the context of higher education in general, that is also going to be a persistent and increasing barrier. I mean, we're sitting, Jolene and I, here in a very privileged institution in Switzerland, and finances are different this year than they were 2 years ago, for sure.
Stefan, your comment about real-time subtitles is something that we did experiment here at EPFL. We had real-time subtitles in 4 languages, so Spanish, German, French, and English, of course. And it was a new AI company at that time who was doing it. But now with advances in AI, that should be really possible to do pretty easily, way more easily than we were able to do it at that point.
But there does continue to be a barrier there related to accent, as we saw this year in Finland. That we had we had a lot of Himalaya and hamsters and other other unusual things. Right, in terms of the challenges of when to organize. If you have a unit related to equity and support within the institution, that actually it would be, so we benefited hugely from the fact that that unit had already contacted childcare. They already had a hypothetical of how could this work. And in fact, that's where that institutional knowledge should sit. You won't be the only, SEFI wouldn't be the only conference that is going to be at NTNU in the next 5 years. So actually that institutional knowledge should sit with them if they are able to find a partnership with a registered childcare provider, because of course, you need the childcare provider to have the insurance and the qualified staff already. But if they can establish that relationship going forward, that would be potentially for a number of different conferences. And but that starting that early would certainly be good.
So in the interest of time, we're going to move slightly ahead. Thank you for all your comments here. This was really useful, and it was really nice to see all these different perspectives. Now, what we would like you to do is think about the future. So looking forward, in our survey, as you have identified, there were several things that we didn't do. There were several things that we didn't ask. And as you have rightly identified, there were many people who didn't respond to the surveys, who were not there at EPFL. And so we don't know what their difficulties might have been. And because we don't have those difficulties, those were completely off our radar. And so now, what I would really like you to do is, for the next 5 minutes, please go to this lovely Miro board that we have prepared for you. And there are several prompts on that board. Feel free to use a sticky note and just respond to any one, as many of them as you would like. And we will come back and have a discussion about that in 5 minutes. And I'm going to start the timer right there. So we have started the timer. All right, while you continue to write your thoughts down, Inej, would you like to bring us together with some ideas that you were seeing in there?
Yeah, I'm loving one of the post-its about what are we missing from this survey, the collecting these random kinds of acts of kindness. I think that's so interesting. As someone who researches empathy in engineering education, I think that's really interesting. And because the idea is also to raise a sense of belonging, right? And we're focusing on individual experiences, but there's something we could do that it's not structured, or think about something that happens within the space. I think that's really lovely. Yeah, I'm also seeing some suggestions in terms of methodologies, right? We need to collect more qualitative data, right? Focus groups, discussion groups. I think the issue here is who to invite. Will they be okay with disclosing some experiences in a focus group setting with others? So there's a lot of nuances that we need to think about, but definitely qualitative data seems a way to go. What else I'm seeing here in terms of more methodology? Yeah, open interviews, paper surveys. So at Lausanne, some of you who attended might remember, but there were QR codes everywhere in the space that people could fill in some small group of questions about their experiences on the go during the conference, but maybe paper would be an option. We have to consider the sustainability aspects of it, but I think it's worth exploring that idea. Observation study. I would love to know more about that. And the person who suggested that, if you're okay with, giving a little bit more of detail, that I think that's fascinating. We would have to navigate the insider-outsider perspectives, but that's really interesting. What else I'm seeing here? Yeah, the formal aspects of SEFI meetings. What other questions we should answer? The formality. and perhaps the focus on individual or institutions that are doing a certain work. And we know by experience ourselves that so many of the work is exactly systemic and collective. So that's an interesting aspect to consider as well.
I think our paper points to some of those questions as well, like in terms of the lens we used and what more we could do. I think there is a lot around that, those formal aspects that points to.
There's another interesting point here. Could the survey ask participants if they consider the kinds of barriers that others face? I think one of the interpretations we made of the data is that for some participants, there are no issues at SEFI, right? Or they're not aware of microaggressions and some unwanted behaviors. So it looks like there's a lot of do in terms of raising awareness for this topic. So that would be an interesting question to ask. Yeah. Another comment here. Any other comment? EDI is about the small things in small quantities, only the few notice. Yeah. That speaks to what we've been discussing so far. Yeah. So the point of the mural board is that you can share your comments anonymously. Otherwise, we would have had a discussion here or typing comments on the chat. I think the mural board will be open, right, Jolene? So if you think about something else, later after the webinar, feel free to add more ideas. We're very welcome to hear your thoughts. Do we want to discuss anything in particular in the webinar right now about some of these points? How are we about time? We still have 5 minutes left.
So yeah, the mural board will stay open for some time. So if you think like any of your colleagues have some ideas that you can put in there. But also if you lose the link, it's no big deal. Just shoot an email to any of the four of us, and that might be the best way to connect with us. In the interest of time, we're going to move so that I can let you off a few minutes before your next Zoom meeting, which will be scheduled on the hour as we usually do. So on our part, this is what we're doing. So we're continuing to make data-informed actions. So the work that started at SEFI 2024 here in Lausanne continued in Tampere and is continuing in Prague as well. Data collection, we started a new data collection in Tampere, again, looking at those in-the-moment small things that are happening. We are going to continue it in Prague, hopefully. And then, well, if Sheffield had their logo ready, I would have put it there. But then since Sheffield, that's still 2 years away, 1.5 years away, it'll also continue in Sheffield. But this whole approach of using data to then inform the decisions that you make is continuing also within the DEISIG with respect to the Susan Eason Award. So you would have seen through the emails that you got from the SEFI News Flash, as well as the postings on LinkedIn, that the award criteria has changed. So Susan Eason Award is meant for the best DEI paper. And so we've tried to be very transparent about what it actually means to be a good DEI paper and not just a good paper in itself. And what are some of the inclusion and exclusion criteria we will be looking for, as well as what are the criteria we will be looking for while deciding the award from the shortlist. So please, if you are writing a paper that has some DEI aspects, please take a look at this inclusion-exclusion criteria. And, who knows, you might be our next Susan Eason Award winner, which would be really lovely. So as Ciara said in the chat, on behalf of the DEISIG, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to put the link to the paper again in the chat in case you didn't get it. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues. If you are organizing a conference and you would like to, get some more information that is not in the paper, we'd be happy to talk to you. And of course, if you have ideas about how we can continue this work within SEFI and within academia in general, please get in touch with us. So in the words of my people, Deo Borenkuru, thank you very much for coming.